Super. All right, let's kick off. Welcome everybody. My name is Guy Boggs. I'm the CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for Transformations in Mining Economies. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our Dig Deeper webinar on climate change and quantifying risks and opportunities for mine closure. I'm going to share my slides. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on whose land we meet and work today, and acknowledge elders past and present. In particular, I'd like to pay my respects to the Balladong people of the Noongar Nation, on whose country I join you today, and recognise their enduring connection and stewardship of country. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. First is to acknowledge that we are recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing both the recorded webinar with participants and the broader community, and we'll also be providing copies of today's slides to participants as well. During today's session, if I can ask that everyone keeps their microphones muted, and if you are having any technical issues, we ask that you use the chat functionality to let the team know around technical issues. But if you've got a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A functionality, which you should see at the top of your screen. Jump to slide. All right, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Anna Littleboy as chair of today's session. Anna is an experienced research leader who uses multidisciplinary approaches to address issues of resources and sustainability. Anna led the Transforming Mining Life Cycles program within the University of Queensland Sustainable Minerals Institute, and previously led the establishment of a new cross-functional national research flagship while with the CSIRO. Through her career, Anna has delivered impact through new business models, environmental innovation, and enhanced social performance in the minerals and energy sector. We're delighted with CRC time that we have her acting in the program three leader role at the moment. But of course, many of you know that Anna was a key initiator of the CRC itself and CRC Time's inaugural research director. Anna, over to you. And first class to me, Anna, you are on mute.
That's a real whack oops, isn't it, for the facilitator of a session? But good day, everyone. I'm delighted to be here because, as the guy said, I've had a long association with CRC Time, and I've had a chance to sort of re-establish that relationship over the past few months. I'm helping out as one of the program leaders for operational solutions. And in that role, I've got to reconnect with a number of the projects that were initiated when I was fully involved with the CRC about a year ago. And one of the things I've always really loved about the CRC Time is that it does really invite people to think in systems, to think about what it is that we need to integrate in order to develop solutions and develop new ways of operating in the world that will help mining communities manage the transition from being a mining community to a post-mining community. And the CRC has to do that in a way that integrates the stakeholders that range from the industry itself to governments and to communities. And the two projects that we're showcasing here today, for me, are both really good examples of the importance of thinking in systems. So we'll be hearing from Maher later on about how we factor in the ultimate complex system of climate change to thinking about closure. But first off, we're going to hear from Ed Holloway about how we think differently, about the way we value what we're trying to do, how we plan to deliver opportunity in a way that extends far beyond our traditional ways of thinking about financial return. So I'm going to be handing over to Ed in a minute. So Ed, currently he's operating as a consultant in strategic mine planning, but he's also a colleague of mine at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. Ed's one of these wonderful people with a very broad background. He's got experience in covering a range of technical, operational and project-based positions in mining with experience in both green and brownfield operations in Australia, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Chile, you name it. He's been around the world. And he's also worked on a range of different commodities. Ed's a member of the AusIMM, but he's also a senior associate at the Financial Services Institute of Australia. So he can bring to the issues that we're looking at here both that financial perspective and a deep knowledge of mining. He has a Bachelor of Engineering in Mining, a Master of Applied Strategic Mine Planning, and a PhD from the University of Queensland in Strategic Mine Planning. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce you to Ed Holloway, who's going to be talking us about our project, a foundational project number 2.4 on valuing opportunity by thinking differently in the mine planning process. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Anna. Let me get a screen share going on here. So coming through, shared the wrong screen. Can you see my presentation? No?
Yes, it's all good, Ed.
Okay, cool. All right. Now that we've got that covered off and everyone can hear me, obviously. Thanks very much for the introduction, Anna. So today I'm going to be talking about Foundation Project 2.4, which is to do with quantifying risks and opportunities. So we had a team of us working on it, myself, Claire, Greg, Dirk and Rodrigo, and we were from a range of different institutions, but probably more significantly, we were from a range of very different technical skill sets, which required collaboration, and that was exceptionally good. We were really able to get into each other's area and understand what was going on. One thing that didn't work as well as we probably would have liked from the outset was engagement with our partners, which is why there's nothing on that here. And that was largely to do with getting all of the data vetted by the case study that we used, which resulted in some delays. But we're making progress on that. And yeah, certainly the collaboration was excellent. So what was the problem that we were focusing on? The plan, essentially, was the problem. And that's a fairly sort of obscure comment. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. If you have the plan or a plan, it therefore must be based on a singular set of deterministic inputs. And I've done an awful lot of planning and pulled together a lot of plans across different timeframes. And the one thing that you can know about the plan is that that is the one thing that will not happen. The other problem with it is that any risks are essentially dropped out because you've got one set of inputs. So you're not getting any sort of dimensionality around what else could happen. The risks may be qualified, and that's better than doing nothing at all. But then, therefore, they're subject to the biases of whoever's qualified those risks and the depth of knowledge that they may have explored in terms of determining those risks and the parameters around them. Another problem with that is that knowledge all then only resides in that person's head. So when the next time comes around that the mining industry decides to pull its patented move of making everyone redundant, all of that corporate IP around those risks walks out the door. It also doesn't particularly well support communication and an understanding of any risks around that, and therefore it can't support any informed strategic decision making. So while I've been talking about that, some of you may have thought of some examples within the operations that you all work at where the plan hasn't actually gone according to plan. Or also you might be thinking of some fairly public things that have not worked particularly well, where there's been risks that have manifested that clearly the operation didn't see coming. This type of issue is particularly relevant when it comes to what's often a planning bifurcation between planning the actual mining operation and planning the environmental management of the waste that's produced. And this project is focused particularly on quantifying those risks across the mine planning and waste management space. So why is any of that relevant? Well, we have a series of business expectations around the performance of the plan. That's particularly important. And we also have societal expectations. So that's growing and it will continue to grow. Social media forms some form of like vigilante force for the mining industry. And the equivalent of capital punishment in that lensing is the revocation of any license to operate. So that's changed a lot over the last decade or so, and we should expect that change to continue. So any complacency regarding the impacts of inadequate risk management across all aspects of the mining industry are likely to be less and less tolerated by all stakeholders as we move forward. That's compounded to an extent by the fact that the business of mining is becoming more complicated while society continues to demand more commodities. So we're right under the microscope and we've got to do better. We can't afford to be putting a foot wrong. The complexity is definitely growing to do with reduced grades. So we've got more waste, we've got more arsenic, we've got more sort of geochem issues. The Complex Ore Bodies project that's been run out of the SMI has some really good info on that type of problem. So we're expected to have sort of flawless performance in what we do. And from that, you can say that if we roll out with the same techniques, we're likely to deliver results that are essentially below expectation. So with that as a bit of context, let me make sure we've got some sort of terminology covered off here. I'm primarily going to be using the word risk, and whether you call it risk or uncertainty, some definitions you might remember from Eric Lilford's talk a few weeks ago, he split it out into risk and uncertainty, intangible and tangible, which made a lot of sense for his project. In this context, we really need to be able to put a distribution around it. So I'm just going to use the words risk, but it can be positive or negative. So as an example, there's a risk that the commodity price will be higher than what you expected it to be. Another point is that the interrelationships between those risks are essential and modelling them and considering them, and therefore we need to look at the integration of the planning activities. So the process that we went through looked a little bit like this. The first thing we did was identify a case study. So I could be sitting here today presenting a bunch of hypotheses as to what would happen, but we decided that it would be better to go with a case study so then we can actually demonstrate the results. We needed that case study to be suitably complex, and we needed it to have existing strategic planning models already developed because they take quite a bit of time to build. We also needed operational domain designs. In this case, we looked at different designs for waste dumps, and we wanted them to have an interrelationship between the risks inherent to them. We then needed probabilistic inputs, and for this project, we looked at commodity prices, groundwater, seismic, geotech, and then onto the analysis. So we wanted to quantify the risk and the interrelationships between the risks, and then assess whether or not that would make any changes to the strategic decisions that would be made. So the objectives of this were to incorporate that operational domain design and the options for it into a strategic planning framework. We wanted to be able to use probabilistic inputs so that we could quantify the associated risks. We also wanted the framework to be flexible. We didn't want it to be something that could only be used for this specific set of risks, but rather to be flexible to potentially incorporate other risks. So before we get into any results, I'll just give you a quick overview of the operation. It's a tier 1 copper gold operation. It's an open pit. It's in a tropical mountainous region. It has high rainfall, and I mean high, more than 10 metres a year, and it's seismically active. So it's certainly a very difficult place to get a dump to stand, and a number of those inputs, there's significant uncertainty around them. So therefore there's risk. We wanted to look at the waste dump design options. So we've got 6 different waste dump design options, and then we've also got the ultimate pit size and the waste dump size. There's obviously a relationship between all of them. And we also included commodity price. So we didn't just want to flick it and look at risks relating to environment. We wanted to actually have a merging of those 2 risks in the one framework. So from the business side of it, we've brought across the commodity price. The risks that we wanted to quantify for the waste dump were the failure size. So if you've got, say, a 300 million tonne dump failure, what's that going to cost? What's it going to cost in terms of production impacts? And for this particular site, there's the potential for it to impact on other waste storage capacities. For the ultimate pit risks, there's essentially 2 risks. Either you make the ultimate pit too big or too small, and I'll cover that a little bit further on in the presentation. And before we start looking at results, I'm just going to say that everything's based on standard NPV. There's nothing different going on. It's all just standard NPV at this stage. Probabilistic analyses, the ones that we assessed here. So for geotech, we had combinations of groundwater, no groundwater, seismic, no seismic. We used critical seismic, and then a couple of different modelling methods being Bishop and Janbu. For the groundwater scenarios, we were looking at the hydraulic conductivity of the face, the dump core, and the drains. So they were all looked at probabilistically and modelled probabilistically. And then the outputs of that process fed into the geotech probabilistic analysis. So the main thing that's transferring across there is where's the phreatic surface going to sit, which is very significant as an input to geotechnical modelling. Excuse me. On the mining and commercial side, we looked at a range of different ultimate pit sizes and also a range of different operating commodity price ranges. Given that this was copper price, we looked at from $1 through to $5, so a nice big range there. Okay, so just before we go into some results, what we're wanting to do here is assess and quantify risks and quantify how these would relate to an impact on value, and then determine whether or not it would impact on the strategy and the decisions that would be made. So for results, this is primarily based around the largest dump option. As I said, we looked at 6 different options, but we're mostly going to focus on the largest one. The rest of it's in the report. So we're into results now, and I'm going to explain this chart. So just bear with me for a moment. So this is all to do with value at risk now. This is a different version of value at risk to what's typically used in the financial services industry. It's been adapted for the mining industry, essentially. Value at risk is no form of panacea. You can still game the system, you can still understate or overstate risks, but it does form a fairly effective way of communicating what those risks look like based on the probabilities that you fed into the model. So what we're looking at on this chart is across the x-axis, we've got copper price going from $1 to $5. But think of it more as on the left, you've got a very, very small ultimate pit, and on the right, you've got a very big ultimate pit. And we've got the value at risk in the box and whisker chart. So for every one of those columns, there's 21 schedules there. So there's a schedule for the $1 pit, the very small pit on the left. There's a schedule run at $1, schedule run at $1.20, $1.40, all the way through to $5. And the output of this, the way you interpret this graph, is the blue columns are the residual resource value at risk. So that's saying that you chose a pit that was too small, and based on the probabilistic inputs that we use for the commodity price, you've actually left value in the ground. And that then transitions through to the orange bars, which are an excess stripping value at risk, where you made your pit too big, you've mined a heap of waste, and what you've uncovered hasn't actually provided enough value to pay for the waste stripping. So if you were to choose a minimum value at risk pit from this chart, you'd be looking at about that $2.20 mark. You don't have to choose a minimum value at risk. That has to do with the risk tolerance for the company. But for the purposes of this exercise, let's assume that you'd choose the minimum value at risk. So you'd be at that $2.20 mark. Okay, so this slide, we're now looking at the value at risk for the dump failure. Again, we've got the very small pit on the left transitioning through to a very large pit on the right. And you can see that with the small pit on the left, you've got a small probability of failure because the dump's small. And you've also got a small dump, so you've got less tonnages involved. So by the time we probabilistically adjust for that and put a price to it and then calculate the value that's at risk, you can see that it increases steadily to the point that at about that $2.40 to $2.60, the dump's pretty much filled and the risk flattens off. But you can definitely see the change in that risk profile as the pit and dump grow. You get a similar trend here with the production impact. So again, when we've got a very small pit on the left, you've got very low risk and the actual value impact on it is very low. And that starts to increase up to a point where it flattens off. And then you've got a fairly constant risk profile once your dump is full. We've got the same trend again for the impact on the other waste management solutions. It tapers off a little bit more on the left-hand side. But then still trends up to being significant risks. You may have noted that the y-axis, being the value at risk axis, is changing between these different options. So let's start to pull that all together in terms of how you could look at how it might impact on decision making. So this chart, it's the same layout. We've got a small pit on the left, a big pit on the right. This time the orange series is the base case. So it's just looking at commodity price. So if you completely separated mine planning from environmental planning, you'd be looking at about that $2.20 pit size and making your decision based on that. If we then include in that same calculation for the value at risk, all of the different risks that we've modeled for the waste dump options, you have the blue series, and you can see that it increases, the value at risk increases significantly earlier, and there's significantly more risk. Again, this is for the largest dump. If you were to choose a minimum value at risk ultimate pit, by the time you've wrapped in the risks relating to the waste dump, you'd be choosing a pit down around that $1.40 mark, which is about 60% the size of the $2.20 pit. So it's a much smaller pit. You'd select a much smaller pit because you're quantifying the risks of making a very big dump. That's not a great outcome, right? Because you've just lost 40% of your reserve. What we've got on this chart is the 6 different dump options that we looked at. Value at risk again. We've also got the same layout with the small pit on the left transitioning through to the big pit on the right. And you can see 2 very clear groupings here. So the blue, orange and grey have much higher value at risk than the yellow and green distribution does. So again, if you were choosing a minimum value at risk for the blue, orange, grey series, you'd be down around the $1.40. But if you're looking at the green and the yellow, you'd be up around the $2 to $2.20 mark. So you're back to being close to where you were based purely on commodity price. So there's definitely a very clear differentiation in the different risk profiles of those dump options. So what can we take away from this? First of all, risk can be quantified. You can use probabilistic inputs and you can get a feeling for how those risks translate through to the impact on the business. They do need to be focused. You can't try and model everything like that. You don't want to try and boil the ocean. And certainly it will impact on strategy. It mandates integration. The understanding of risks across the different technical disciplines is essential if you want to do this type of work. And yes, it does involve a greater level of analysis. However, it is achievable. Certainly it requires more effort. And I put a note there about scalable computing. So we've just skimmed through just under 3,000 complete life of mine schedules that have been condensed into those few charts. So that's a lot of schedules. So what I did was I designed this model so that it was ready to run like this. And I set it up on a Friday afternoon on a compute cluster, pressed go, went home for the weekend, came in on Monday morning with just the right amount of data to keep me out of mischief. So it is achievable, but it needs to be designed to work. How can industry use these findings? Well, first and foremost, informed strategic decision making. It also supports communication between stakeholders and it ingrains integrated planning. So I don't mean like you'd say, oh yeah, we had a half-day workshop and we connected on LinkedIn. You know what keeps your colleagues awake at night when it comes to risk. You know the things that you could change that will make their risk profile better or worse. You understand it. You've had the debates. It's very, very integrated. You also have a structured capture of that corporate IP. So, you know, if everyone does get made redundant, there's at least a capture of it somewhere within the actual planning process. And there's an understanding of those risks by decision makers, which is absolutely essential if you want to make good decisions. Implications of that is that understanding and quantifying risk is possible. It requires more effort, absolutely, but it will support superior strategic decision making. And based on some of the introductory comments I made, it's essential. I think we need to put more effort into this so that we can make sure that we're making really good decisions and we don't set a foot wrong. Knowledge equals confidence. So I've been involved in a lot of projects, particularly greenfield style projects, where it's gone for approval and whoever needs to sign off on the $5 or $6 billion hasn't wanted to because they've sensed that there's risk there that they can't see. So they haven't had the knowledge and the confidence to sign off on it. So you end up with these projects that just keep going on to another stage, another study stage, another study stage. You can use this type of an approach to reduce risk and reduce risk profiles in both an operational sense, post-closure sense, and also during transition. and it provides a platform for improved levels of communication between all stakeholders, so people can have more of an understanding of what's likely to happen, what they should expect with confidence. My last slide here, a couple of my thoughts on future research and where it could go. You could use an expanded framework. It needs a risk typology plus methodology. So different risks need to be piped into these frameworks in different places. My favourite example of this is a lot of groups like to try and model the commodity price in the financial model. That's just a crime. If you want to look at variations in commodity price, it's going to impact on your selection of ultimate pit. It's going to impact on your cutoff grade or product differentiation and a range of other things along the way. So you can't just tack it into the financial model. It really needs a how-to. So after this presentation, there's not enough information here for anyone to go and replicate this. And even if you went through the rather large report that we've pulled together, it still doesn't really give you a guide as to how to do this. So that's probably something that would really need to be done. We could also consider incorporating a wider range of risks. So we've looked at sort of 5 or 6 risks and how they interrelate. That could be expanded. And then also there's the potential for collaboration, obviously, with some of the other CRC time projects. So if, for example, project 2.3 came up with a different perspective of value, this framework would be flexible enough to incorporate that. So that's a couple of my ideas. And if anyone else has got any other ideas, feel free to email me equally with any questions. Email's just there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was fascinating, actually. Now, before I go on, I have a question for you after that, but I would like to just encourage everyone, please use the Q&A chat for any questions you might have. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and I can moderate the questions and put them through to Ed, so feel free to ask. While you're thinking about that and putting your questions on the Q&A, Ed, you've painted a picture there of something that is achievable. It is achievable and scalable to actually factor in many more dimensions of risk into the decision making about the design of a mine. And yes, you've talked about, but you've got to put a bit more effort into it and you know, deal with more data and everything. But you painted a picture there of something that really seems to me could address a number of issues that are important to people who work into CRC time. So my question is really, why hasn't this been done before? What's the biggest barrier to actually implementing something of this sort?
That's a really good question, Anna. I think there's probably a couple of components to it. The first one is that pulling together any type of mine plan requires an awful lot of effort, and a lot of the times the way it's approached is not necessarily particularly efficient. So I'll often talk about a grind to analysis ratio in the work that we do, and often it's terrible. It'll be like 90% grind or 99% grind, and there's very little analysis time. And that has to do essentially with the planning architecture. So if all the effort's going in places that aren't really adding value, then you don't have time. And a lot of planning teams, if you said that they had to produce 10 plans, they're going to end up in the fetal position on the floor because it's just a massive effort. So I think it's, in one word, it's the planning architecture. The planning architecture needs to be designed to facilitate impactful analysis. We need to rely on well-scripted code and compute clusters to scale it, but it needs to be designed for scalability.
Okay, thank you. I kind of, you know, it's not my area of risk and uncertainty, but another thing that you did mention at the end there was about a typology around risk, and right at the beginning of your talk you mentioned some of the work that Eric Lilford has been doing for CRC time. Clearly there's a little bit of language around risk, has many different interpretations. What would be your suggestion on maybe trying to get some standardization in there? Is that something you think is achievable?
I'm sure it is. it would require an amount of cat herding to get everyone on the same page and using the same language. I'm sure it's possible, and different industries particularly use different terminology around this. But yeah, absolutely, I'm sure it's possible. And we might, as we get further down this path, given that it is research, we might actually need to develop some of our own nomenclature that talks very specifically to what we're trying to say within the CRC. And I very much suspect that Eric's going to end up there. He's already pushing a few boundaries in terms of that. So yeah, but I'm sure it's possible.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to seeing that. That'll be another of the exciting conversations that I hope the CRC can facilitate over the next few years. I'm not seeing a question in the Q&A, so I'm just gonna be a little bit quiet for 30 seconds just to see whether anyone is just being shy about putting a question in the Q&A box. And believe me, it's hard for me to stay quiet for 30 seconds.
You didn't quite make 30 seconds, Anna, but it was a good effort.
I see silence as a void to be filled, unfortunately. Well, I think what I might do is once again say thank you very much, Ed. This was a project I was, Bev, great. I think you put that in the chat, Bev, but give me a moment. Let me pop over there. Love to hear Ed's thoughts on conversations between changing reserve declaration and risk incorporation. So is this going to impact on the way we report our oil reserves?
There's absolutely the potential for that to happen. Yep, absolutely. Along the lines of whenever the commodity price changes significantly or new drilling comes in, it'll be very similar to that. So if you identify a new risk or you find that in fact there's an awful lot of waste that's particularly nasty, again, all of these things have the potential to impact on the oil reserve. So yeah, absolutely, Bev, you're very right there. I think there's actually a couple in the Q&A, is there?
They may be coming in now.
Oh yeah, I can see one here from Ewan.
Yeah. So Ewan, thank you for asking, how do you deal with the rate variation, particularly in the context of net present value, which is linked to risk via the discount rate? So how do you deal with rate variation?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. In this case, we've not touched the discount rate. You're absolutely right. And if you have the next, say, 3 days, we can talk through it in detail. But essentially, there's a couple of different schools of thought around the discount rate. And generally speaking, the assumption is that the discount rate deals with systematic risk, not so much technical risk. So we've peeled that out here and left the discount rate stand as it is. I think there's absolutely, and it's a place we need to go, right? The discount rate does not support good strategic decision making if you go out anywhere more than, say, roughly 10 or 15 years, particularly if you're trying to look at strategic decisions for how's the mining industry going to provide commodities over the next 100 years, which is probably where strategic decision making needs to be looking. The discount rate is a mortal enemy of any useful decision making in that space, and it's not isolated to mining. So you think of storage of nuclear waste or anything that's truly works into perpetuity, like forestry and agriculture. We're completely out of step by using NPV, and we can't maintain a usable dialogue with those other industries, particularly when we're competing for the same land. So it's a great question, and it really strikes at the heart of some of the things that we have to sort out as an industry, but it is absolutely a Pandora's box as well. It's going to take a lot of research and time.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. I think that's a really important statement that many people will resonate with. I think that discounting doesn't always promote the best long-term strategic decision making, and there's probably many people with assets near closure on their books at the moment that are kind of, that's quite a resonant statement for them now. So thank you very much for the presentation, for presenting the project. And if you want to get more, the report is on the website. There's a description of the project on the website. And as Ed said, he's extended the invitation to people to speak to him if you have anything more you'd like to ask him. Thanks, Ed. With that, I'd like to move on to our second presentation, which is going to be from Maher, who is another of my colleagues at the University of Queensland. He's Director of Research and a Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ. And he leads the research there to inform sustainability strategies, in particular with government, but also with industry partners. Ray actually led this project, and he did that sort of fairly closely after leading a major program on industry and resources climate adaptation planning for the Queensland government. And this project sort of follows on from some of the thinking he and his team had been doing there. I think some of his team are on the line as well, so welcome to Rachel Buchan and Lynette Molyneux. I'm going to hand over to Ray pretty quickly now, if that's all right, Ray, for you to talk to us about the work you did for Project 5.3 on transitions and climate change.
Thank you very much, Anna, and really keen to be talking to everybody now. And thank you, Egg, for there's some of the key points that you brought up are actually a really nice segue. And I think while we're taking quite different approaches, sort of necessarily to different types of risks and different sets of issues that we're talking about, so some of your key points I think I'll use as a segue myself. And the first is that inadequate risk management is really becoming intolerable, and much that's increasing over time, and also around the time frame, which I'll touch on in a minute. But firstly, our project was really the foundational project looking at climate impacts on mining systems and on transitions in mining economies. And the project team had myself, Rachel, and Lynette from the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland, and also Kristen McLean from CSIRO, Professor Anna Littleboy, thank you for your input and guidance on the project as well, and also Martin Stringer and Professor Rick Valenta from the Sustainable Minerals Institute as well. So it was a nice team, and again, very interdisciplinary backgrounds, and all adding something different to the project, because it's a pretty curly set of challenges that we're dealing with. So the problem, I guess, is really understanding and managing the impacts of climate change on mining systems, and that's all encompassing and pretty vast. So how do you make a start on that? And I suppose the first way that I like to think about it is imagine someone going to a live mine site and doing a risk analysis, but only looking at trip hazards. And they could go in deeper and deeper into looking at trip hazards, and they could identify every single possible trip hazard on this site, quantify them down to the nth degree, and think of what they've missed. Think of what that risk, that unknown risk, means for the organisation, for the people who work there, for the local communities, for the environment, and certainly for the business owners by not looking into that critical set of issues that they could have and should have known about. And that's what we're doing most of the time so far with climate change in the sector as well. So there's this small subset of climate impacts on the mining system that are typically discussed and analysed, and the very large majority of them are kind of off the radar at the moment. So when people might be looking forward with this pretty narrow frame and saying, well, the risks don't look too bad, we can manage these impacts, that's a pretty risky risk assessment to be making. So if we can take a broader view of this, we can actually get a much, much clearer picture of what's happening in the climate and its impacts across the mining system, then we can really make much better and safer decisions. And tying back to Ed, some of this is at a 100-year time frame that we certainly need to be considering when we're talking about those types of decisions of the future of a sector. But also it's happening at the 10-year time frame in a couple of years, and even historical, and it's already happening and well underway.
Ray, are you sharing your screen, or do you think you're sharing your screen?
I beg your pardon. I did think I was sharing. Thank you for flagging that, Hannah. I certainly was sharing my screen. And here's the here's the list of names. You'll see this in the slides that we'll share. And here's this silly little cartoon of a someone missing most of the impacts that are on the horizon. So I guess instead of summarizing the problem, that climate change is currently the single biggest driver of transformations in mining economies. It's certainly not something that we can afford to have off our radars. But unfortunately, most mining sector stakeholders lack a complete framework to identify climate impacts. And so what exists, and there is some great stuff out there, but what exists is usually quite limited, and it's certainly very disconnected. So what that means is that currently most risks and opportunities of climate change are overlooked, and this puts major risks onto communities and organisations alike. So what can we provide in that space in this pretty small foundational project? The first is looking at climate impacts and mining systems, and we've provided a new framework for really understanding a diverse range of climate impacts. We also provide a synthesis of different risks and opportunities for the mining system driven by climate change. We look at some of the ways that organisations are responding to climate change in their public documents, etc. And then there's some other very important pieces. So we've got some scenarios, climate scenarios, and what that means for the mining sector. There's some quantification of some critical parameters about climate change. Some of them are mapped regionally, and there's also importantly a review of Indigenous perspectives of climate change, very relevant to the sector. So I'm just talking about these first three pretty briefly, but please go and have a look at the report. There's some excellent other work there. So firstly, most of the examination of these issues at the moment is really looking at industry operations. So this is talking about, a live mine site and what are some of the physical impacts of climate change on that mine site. So for example, that's things like flood risk, that's increased risks of bushfire, issues like that. Sometimes there's some examination of a bit of a broader perspective of what the industry operations really look like. So that's not just the operation itself, that's the technology that's used in the sector, about exploration, looking at processing and transport. And when you do that, there's a broader set of physical climate risks that some decision makers might start taking into account. So there's certainly increased competition for water with environmental and community needs. There might be delays in transport delays from extreme weather events, for example. But they're still all physical risks. The leading industry frameworks in this space, like the TCFD, I won't go into that now, but include things like financial and transition impacts. And of course, that means there's other things that we can start considering. But even this is still looking at the industry operation itself, and the context is really, really important. So the social, economic, and environmental context is all being affected by climate change as well, and that all drives impacts back on the mining system. So our finance system, permissions and social license, the workforce and communities, the local natural environment is all also receiving different types of impacts from climate change. These could be physical impacts on biodiversity, for example. It could be financial impacts like risks of stranded assets and climate liability, and certainly changing regional centres. And finally, what about closure? Post-mine futures and rehabilitation is another really critical issue directly being impacted by climate change, as is the rest of the mining system. So firstly, I suppose I'm saying that we've got to ensure that when we're considering climate impacts on mining systems, when we can't afford to just take a reductionist view and look at this relatively small set of issues here, which is still important, but there's a much larger mining system at play, and there's a much greater range of diverse climate impacts affecting the mining system that we need to take into account. So there's a lot there, but feel free to have a look at the report. We can unpack that a little further. So the next thing we wanted to do is to really look at a set of these different types of risks and opportunities across the mining system. We synthesise these from reviews of industry and academic literature, from surveys of industry professionals, to workshops with stakeholder groups, interviews as well. And from across these different inputs, we were looking for physical climate impacts, financial impacts, and impacts of transition, usually to a low carbon economy. Now, these aren't all risks. Some of these are risks, but there's also plenty of opportunities, and we certainly want to be aware of them so we can position ourselves well in the changing future. Now, no expectation that anyone can actually read this on their screen. It's just to give you an idea that there's a whole range of different risks and opportunities across these different factors, physical, financial, and transition, and they apply right across the mining system that I showed you in the previous slide. So many of these sit at kind of the general space applicable to the Australian mining context overall, and some of these are particularly relevant to one sector or another, or one community or another. So it's really important to tailor this to different uses, but there's certainly a foundation there, and now a more comprehensive framework there that organisations and communities can use to inform their decisions. So the next little piece, sorry, and I should say, again, it's pretty clear that if we're only looking at this narrow set of risks of physical impacts like flood risk on operations, then we're neglecting nearly everything. And I don't want to be in a position, if I was a senior decision maker, where my risk analysis or my strategic decision making or my financial planning was neglecting nearly all of the most significant impacts driving change in the mining sector. That's a pretty big deal. But thankfully, by bringing together a lot of leading research from across industry and academia, we can have a much more robust framework to do that. So again, no one can read it here. Check out the report, and we've got 2 academic journal articles following as well. So another piece that I'll only touch on it super briefly, but it's in the report. We also looked at mining under 3 different climate scenarios, because the way these different risks and opportunities play out is really different depending on what's actually happening with global climate change in total, but also the global and national and local approaches to pursuing different climate impacts. So we considered these different climate scenarios. This aligns with the leading research around the world, looking at climate impacts, especially by the the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, the IPCC, and increasingly by industry and financial institutions around the world. So when we did that, I won't go into what the scenarios were in detail now, but they're useful there in the report, and I've shared the link to the report in the chat as well. But some of the key findings that are really relevant here. So the first, and this is a big one, is that transformation of the Australian mining sector is inevitable due to the impacts of climate change. And that's going to occur either due to the transformation of the global economy to a low carbon economy, or the first is either under these scenarios where the global economy is successfully transforming to a low carbon economy, then that is driving major change in the mining sector. So that's one way in which the mining sector in Australia might transform, or certainly significantly transition in response. The other is if the global economy doesn't effectively shift to a low carbon economy, and we are dealing with consequences of extreme levels of global warming, then that in itself is going to drive very, very significant changes in the mining sector from across a whole range of issues. So in either cases, change is happening, it's already begun, and that's certainly the future, and that's very much going to accelerate over time. So it certainly, I should say, really underpins the importance of a group like the CRC for transformations in mining economies. This is exactly what something like a CRC, this kind of broad partnerships and research can do. The second is that there's pretty obviously very different trajectories for, what's known as tech minerals versus fossil fuels. That's largely because fossil fuel development is incompatible with either of the Paris scenarios, and that just means that if that scenario comes to pass, and that's the Paris Agreement in which Australia and most of the world's countries have signed up to, under that scenario of managing climate change, there won't be large-scale ongoing fossil fuel development. That's clearly a big change. At the same time, mining and processing of critical minerals, there is an enormous opportunity for regional development and job growth if we're aware of those opportunities, if government and industry are working together and effectively to look at systemic opportunities for driving that sector and those industries effectively. The third big sort of finding coming out of these scenarios is, I've made pretty clear, I think, in the earlier slides, but is that the non-physical risks, and we're talking about the risks of stranded assets related to investment, changes in investment and demand profiles, insurance and approvals, social license to operate. Those non-physical risks are more significant than the physical impacts of climate change, but receive much less attention so far. So that in itself is a pretty big issue, and one that I'd certainly think that the different stakeholders right across the sector, government, industry, community groups, and the regions are really want to be aware of, so they can plan effectively, make decisions, and really build resilience into their operations and their futures. Now, the last little piece, and I'm looking at my clock here, there's not a lot of time to go, but we looked at the ways that different organisations are responding publicly to climate change. So we looked at 45 different organisations, just a small snapshot from across different components, mining companies themselves, peak bodies, finance, etc. You can see the list there. And just use that as a brief sample on what's the sector looking at in terms of these sorts of issues. Just two examples I'll just give here. One is the extent of discussion around climate change. And the very large majority, so 84% of the organisations we examined, discussed climate change issues and impacts and climate policies in official publications. That's the very large majority, and that's very different to what we would have seen 5 to 10 years ago. There's still a small minority of organisations that aren't publicly discussing climate change, or are kind of doing it in a very minimal way, but they're definitely in the minority. Again, that's a big change in the last 10 years. We'll see an even bigger change in the following 5 to 10 years. Clearly, there's momentum there. So people are talking about it, but what issues? What's being discussed? So this, again, just one example of this. We looked at which types of risks, again, there are many opportunities, but just which types of risks were different organisations looking at? Were they in their public discussion where they're talking about financial impacts of climate change, physical impacts, or transition impacts? And particularly, what about impacts on closure? And you can see these different groups in their communications talked about different sets of issues. But just to point out here, this giant white space at the top, that's the issues that weren't being talked about by the proportions of organisations talking about them. So that means that most types of risks were not being discussed, certainly at least in the public environment, and there's a huge risk that brings of not managing them effectively. So this is a gap. There's some great progress being made, but in this sector, which is not at the same pace, I guess, of thinking or discussion in this area that some other sectors in the economy are at. This is a massive thing that we want to address and deal with, and hopefully this provides a foundation for doing some of that in a more systemic way. So some of the key findings that came out of this analysis of organisations' responses to climate change, firstly, is that there is a high level of agreement. Organisations were actually generally aligned. They acknowledged climate change. They talked about the climate agreements and acknowledged this necessary transition to a low carbon economy. That's now the norm, and there was a few limited exceptions to that rule now. But the second is that there's this very limited scope of discussion, and the types of impacts that were discussed were relatively narrow. They're certainly not aligning with the actual sets of risks and opportunities, nor the scale of impending transition of the sector. That's something that we want to manage progressively and proactively, so we need to get out in front of it. And finally, there's this discrepancy between what's talked about in the dialogue in terms of where organisations want to be in terms of supporting climate mitigation, and the types of actions they're making aren't yet in line with where their ambitions are in that space. So again, I think there's a lot of work that certainly the CRC is very well positioned to contribute to, is bridging that gap between organisations' ambitions in climate change and their actions. Finally, Indigenous voices. So across the 45 different organisations that we looked at, not a single one actually included Indigenous perspectives or knowledge in their discussion of climate impacts on the mining sector. that's pretty surprising, I think, in this day and age. There's certainly a lot of space to be done there. There's some other fantastic CRC work being done broadly in that space. I really hope that that can take include climate analysis and planning within that, because it's virtually absent elsewhere. So in my last 30 seconds, looking at the clock, so how can industry use these findings? So firstly, we can use this climate impacts and mining systems framework to inform decision making. We can work with organisations and communities to tailor it for your own organisation or area. It's sitting at a general level, but the framework's there and it aligns with some of the global standards for looking at these sets of issues. We can incorporate thorough analysis of risks and opportunities throughout strategic planning, throughout policy development, and throughout risk assessments. And there's a foundation to draw from the world's sort of state-of-the-art research in that space. And we can certainly enable Indigenous perspectives and knowledge to inform our planning and action on climate mitigation and adaptation. So there's a role to play for everyone. We've all got opportunities, and now there's a great consolidation, I guess, of the decision making and research in that space that we can build on. So have a look at the report. There's lots of other great research there that I haven't touched on in that report. But if we can do this well, then we can really build resilience in our communities. We can avoid these massive stranded assets and stranded communities, and we can position the sector to really thrive amongst these rapidly changing times. Thank you very much. Really happy to reach out or put your questions in the box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And good to see sort of so much information pulled together, particularly in that space between who's talking about what and what are they doing about what they're talking about. So thank you very much for that. Please, questions for Ray through the Q&A. That would be fantastic. Ray, just while people are thinking about some questions for you, I'd like to Kirsty Beckett actually posted a question for Ed. So Ed, I'm sorry to do this, Adam. I know it's out of order, but Kirsty's question, Ed, was really about the level to which you've thought about cost uncertainty and providing information about cost uncertainty as part of an environmental approval process, which may then have some kind of impact on the level of bond that might be considered.
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. So the risks around cost, specifically, we modelled correlations between the costs and the commodity price. So they're statistically significant. So if you start flexing commodity price, you have to move cost as well, or otherwise you're creating nonsense, essentially. So we included that correlation, but we haven't taken it through to the level of understanding what it would do to bonds. I think before you got to the level of detail around cost confidence, we'd have to resolve the issue with the discount rate in a way that everyone was comfortable with. And there's a lot of different things that are done on that. Some of the closure costs are in an undiscounted format. Some companies don't discount those closure costs at all. It's a good question, but we haven't looked specifically at bonds or the closure bonds. I trust that answers the question.
Thanks for that, Ed. I'll just sort of switch the attention back to Ray's project now. Brendan Liveris has sort of expressed some appreciation for that whole of life of mine consideration of climate impacts. The thing that I just wanted to pick up on is, you know, your conclusion and recommendation at the end, which is actually that dearth of information about including Indigenous perspectives into this conversation. Do you have any thoughts about why that is, why there is such a gap there?
And until very recently, there was a huge gap, you know, entirely in this space around thorough analysis and discussion of climate impacts on mining. So again, we can see that that's now changed very rapidly. But as that changes happen and organisations sort of across the mining system are really looking at climate impacts, then I guess it's just been the last piece of the puzzle to be incorporated. And I think it's certainly a shame that that's the case so far. But I'd also really encourage people to reach out to one of the co-authors that I've identified in the in this document from CSIRO, so she can really provide more insight in that as well.
Thanks very much, Ray. There being no further questions and it being 3 o'clock, Guy, I think particularly some of those recommendations at the end, I know both climate change and Indigenous voices, both close to your heart. I'm going to hand back to you to close off this particular Dig Deeper webinar.
Resonates incredibly strongly, Anna. And look, I'd just like to thank our wonderful presenters, Ed and Ray, for your presentations today, and going back into the teams that you've worked on. It really came through clearly for me, this value in the collaborative effort that's happened in these projects, and the value of the work that's coming through that process. So thank you. And thank you to you, Anna, for your wonderful chairing. Always a pleasure working with you. So lucky to have you in the CRC at the moment again. So just in terms of little formalities, we will be sending a link to the next webinar to attendees today, so look out for that one. There'll be a link to a survey put up in the chat as well, so please, we're always welcoming your feedback. We're a new organisation just testing this way in which we're communicating our research with our partners and other stakeholders. Please let us know what we can do better or how we can improve it, or how, if it's going well for you. It's really valuable feedback for us. I had just one note to finish on, and for me it was this really strong message that came through today that resonated with a piece that I was reading, again, the EY, number 1, number 2, number 3 risks for the mines and metals sectors are environment and social is number 1, decarbonisation is number 2, and 3 is licence to operate. Today's presentation has really talked about how, if we're not taking this seriously, it's going to have a massive impact on the way in which we mine into the future, and we've got an opportunity here to transform how we mine to address risk and capture the opportunity presented through, or as well as managing risk through the climate space. So thanks, guys. Really enjoyed today, and hope everyone else enjoyed.